Jacksonville 911, Robinson.
Hi, I'm at Walmart. I'm in turn. I think I've been taken.
What do you mean?
Taken by a stranger. I can't find her.
And you say you at the Walmart on Lim Turner?
Yes, I am.
Okay, where did you last see her at?
Walmart. I met a man today at Dollar General. He saw that I was struggling to buy them some clothes. He drove us here to buy us some clothes, and the only reason I went with him because she said his wife was going to be here. Because I told him I don't take rides with strangers.
Okay, ma'am. What color shirt?
I don't remember what clothes she's wearing because I'm panicking right now. I'm trying not to panic.
Okay, and she was last seen with this man?
Yes, he said he was going to McDonald's and he hasn't been there because the store is closed right now.
Okay, is he a white man or a black man?
A white man. He's got white short hair and he's got dark eyebrows.
You said dark short hair?
No, he's got white hair and dark eyebrows. I had a strange feeling about him when I first met him, and he took her to the dressing room twice.
June 21st, 2013, Jacksonville, Florida. Inside a busy Walmart, hundreds of people pushed shopping carts through brightly lit aisles, comparing prices, laughing with their children, and finishing their errands before closing time. Security cameras quietly recorded every movement, just as they did every night. No one noticed the little girl in the orange dress. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking anyone for help. She wasn't being dragged away. Instead, she walked calmly beside an older man who smiled at her as if he were a trusted family friend. To every shopper who glanced in their direction, they looked completely ordinary. Less than 12 hours later, that same little girl would be found dead in a shallow creek, only a few miles away. She was just 8 years old. Her name was Cherish Perrywinkle. The man walking beside her wasn't her grandfather. He wasn't a family friend. He wasn't even someone her mother had known before that evening. He was a convicted child predator who had spent decades moving through Florida's criminal justice system, leaving behind warning after warning that, in hindsight, painted a terrifying picture. Authorities already knew who he was. Mental health experts had already warned he was dangerous. The law had already created a process designed specifically to stop offenders like him from walking free. And somehow, he was still standing inside that Walmart. What happened next would horrify investigators, devastate an entire community, and force Florida to confront painful questions about how a man with such an extensive history was ever allowed back onto the streets. But the tragedy didn't begin inside Walmart. It began hours earlier, outside a small discount store, where a struggling mother was trying to buy clothes she simply couldn't afford. She wasn't looking for charity. She wasn't looking for a stranger. She was just trying to make sure her daughter had something nice to wear on a flight the following morning. A flight Cherish had been talking about for weeks. She was finally going to California to spend time with her father. She had no idea that excitement would never become reality. What makes this case especially heartbreaking isn't just the brutality of the crime. It's how ordinary everything looked before it happened. There were no threats, no weapons, no violent confrontation. Just a man who offered to help a family that desperately needed kindness. For years afterward, people asked the same question. Why would any mother trust a complete stranger? But that question misses the point. The real question is far more disturbing. Why was a man with Donald Smith's history free to approach vulnerable families in the first place? Tonight, we'll follow every step of that timeline, from the moment Donald Smith first noticed Cherish's family, to the surveillance footage that captured her final known moments alive, to the investigation that uncovered not only one of Florida's most horrifying child murders, but also a series of institutional failures that many believe made it possible. If you appreciate deeply researched true crime documentaries based on verified investigations and court records, consider subscribing to Fact Trace. Every week, we uncover real cases that deserve to be remembered, not just for how they ended, but for the lives at the center of them. And if this documentary leaves an impression on you, a simple like helps more people discover these stories. Now, let's go back to where this tragedy really began. After everything that happened, countless people would ask the same question. How could a mother trust a complete stranger? It's a question that has followed Rain Perrywinkle for more than a decade. But before judging a decision made in one desperate moment, it's important to understand the life that led to it. Because this story didn't begin with Donald Smith. It began with a mother doing everything she could to give her children a normal life. In the summer of 2013, Rain Perrywinkle lived in Jacksonville, Florida, with her husband Aaron and her 3 daughters, Cherish, Destiny, and little Naya. Money was always tight. There were days when every dollar had to be stretched as far as possible just to keep food on the table, pay the bills, and make sure the girls had what they needed. Like many families living paycheck to paycheck, unexpected expenses weren't just inconvenient, they could become overwhelming. Despite those struggles, Rain's daughters rarely saw the full weight of the financial pressure their mother carried. She tried to shield them from it. Especially Cherish. Born on Christmas Eve in 2004, Cherish Lily Perrywinkle had a personality that seemed far bigger than her 8 years. Her father, Billy Perrywinkle, often described her as a child who found joy in the smallest things. She loved drawing animals. She loved playing make-believe with her younger sisters, often insisting she was the teacher while they became her students. She had recently learned how to ride a bicycle, a milestone she couldn't stop talking about. Family members remembered her as protective, caring, and endlessly curious. She asked questions about everything. She laughed often, and she had a habit of making friends almost anywhere she went. Most of all, she was excited, because the very next morning, June 22nd, she would board a plane to California to spend time with her father. For weeks, she'd been counting down the days. Like most 8-year-olds, the trip wasn't just about seeing family. It was an adventure, a chance to fly on an airplane, a chance to wear something special, a chance to make memories she'd probably talk about for months afterward. Rain wanted that excitement to feel complete. She knew money was scarce, but she also knew how much a new outfit could mean to a little girl looking forward to a special day. It wasn't about expensive clothes. It was about giving Cherish something that made her feel confident and happy. Something she could proudly wear when she stepped off that plane. That simple goal, finding an affordable dress, would unknowingly place the family in the path of one of Florida's most dangerous predators. Earlier that afternoon, Rain gathered her daughters and headed to a nearby Dollar General. She hoped she'd find inexpensive clothes the family could afford before the stores closed. As they browsed the aisles, reality began to set in. Even the discounted prices were more than she expected. At one point, according to store employees, Rain quietly admitted she wasn't sure she had enough money to pay for everything the girls needed. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't loud. It was simply an exhausted mother being honest about her situation. She had no idea someone else had heard every word. Somewhere nearby, a man was watching. Not casually, not by coincidence. Watching. He listened as Rain spoke about her financial struggles. He watched the children. He noticed the uncertainty on her face. And in that moment, he saw exactly what predators often look for. A family under pressure. Someone vulnerable. Someone who might be willing to accept help from a stranger. To everyone else inside that Dollar General, he looked completely ordinary. Gray hair, soft-spoken, calm. The kind of man most people wouldn't think twice about passing in a grocery store. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Long before he ever introduced himself to the Perrywinkles, long before he offered to buy those children new clothes, Donald James Smith had spent decades revealing exactly who he was. The problem wasn't that no one knew. The problem was that, despite everything already on his record, he was still free. And in just a few moments, he would walk up to Rain Perrywinkle with a smile and an offer that sounded too generous to refuse. Outside the Dollar General, the evening air was warm and humid, the kind of summer night Floridians barely notice anymore. Rain Perrywinkle was thinking about only one thing: how she was going to make the money she had stretched just a little further. She wasn't looking for help. She wasn't asking strangers for money. She was simply trying to figure out how to avoid disappointing her daughters. As the girls walked toward the parking lot, an older man approached with an easy smile. He didn't rush toward them. He didn't act nervous. If anything, he seemed patient, comfortable, the kind of person most families wouldn't immediately see as a threat. "Excuse me," he said politely. "My wife and I have a Walmart gift card with about $150 left on it. We'd love to help you buy the girls some clothes. It was an offer almost too generous to believe. Rain looked at him carefully. Every instinct tells parents to be cautious around strangers. But nothing about Donald James Smith matched the image most people have of a dangerous predator. He was 56 years old. Gray-haired, soft-spoken. He spoke calmly. He smiled often. He claimed he and his wife simply wanted to do something kind for a family that looked like they could use a little help. He even mentioned having children of his own. To Rain, it sounded like one struggling family receiving unexpected kindness from another. She hesitated. She asked questions. Where was his wife? Smith calmly explained that she would meet them at Walmart. Everything sounded reasonable. There was no pressure, no anger, no urgency. That patience was no accident. Experienced predators rarely begin with threats. They begin by earning trust. Investigators would later believe Donald Smith had been watching the family long before he ever introduced himself. He had listened as Rain worried about money inside the store. He had watched the children. He had waited until exactly the right moment to step forward. It wasn't random. It was calculated. Eventually, Rain accepted the offer. She, Cherish, Destiny, Naya, and Donald Smith climbed into his white van and headed toward a nearby Walmart. It was a decision that would later dominate headlines across America. But in that moment, it felt like a small act of hope. A mother believing there were still good people willing to help. What she couldn't possibly know was who had just gotten behind the wheel. Donald James Smith wasn't simply a stranger. He was one of Florida's longest registered sex offenders. His history stretched back decades. In 1977, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a child. Years later, authorities arrested him again after he attempted to lure 2 teenage girls into his van. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Even then, he hadn't stopped. In 2009, investigators accused him of pretending to be a child welfare worker to gain access to another young girl. That case was eventually reduced to a misdemeanor during plea negotiations, significantly reducing the legal consequences he faced. Time after time, Donald Smith entered the criminal justice system, and time after time, he found his way back out. Perhaps the most disturbing part wasn't simply his criminal history. It was what experts inside the system had already concluded. Years before Cherish's murder, mental health professionals evaluating Smith warned that he posed an exceptionally high risk of offending again. Some recommended that he never be released back into the community. Florida even had a legal process designed specifically for offenders considered too dangerous to walk free after completing their prison sentences. Donald Smith was exactly the kind of offender that process had been created for. Yet somehow, it failed. Just 21 days after leaving prison, he was sitting behind the wheel with 3 little girls in his van. As they drove toward Walmart, the conversation remained casual. Smith joked with the children, asked simple questions, smiled. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested the violence investigators would uncover just hours later. By the time they pulled into Walmart's parking lot, Rain believed she'd met someone genuinely kind. Donald Smith had achieved exactly what he wanted. He had become someone the family no longer feared. And inside one of America's busiest retail stores, surrounded by bright lights, security cameras, and hundreds of shoppers, the final stage of his plan was about to begin. As Donald Smith pulled into the Walmart parking lot, nothing about the evening appeared unusual. Cars filled the parking spaces. Families pushed shopping carts toward their vehicles. Employees gathered abandoned carts from the lot. Inside, it was business as usual. For Rain Perrywinkle, the trip felt like an unexpected blessing. Only an hour earlier, she'd been wondering how she could possibly afford clothes for her daughters. Now, thanks to the generosity of a man she had only recently met, that burden seemed to have disappeared. It must have felt like one of those rare moments when life unexpectedly became a little easier. The family stepped inside. Bright fluorescent lights stretched across the massive store. The girls immediately became excited, pointing toward colorful dresses, shoes, and toys. Like many children, they weren't thinking about danger. They were thinking about new clothes. Investigators later reviewed hours of Walmart surveillance footage. What those cameras revealed wasn't a sudden kidnapping. It was something far more unsettling. For nearly 2 hours, Donald Smith stayed close. Not too close, just close enough. Sometimes he walked beside the family. Other times he lingered several steps behind them. Occasionally, he disappeared into another aisle before quietly returning. To anyone watching in real time, it looked like an older man helping a struggling mother shop for her children. To detectives reviewing the footage later, it looked very different. It looked like someone making sure an opportunity never slipped away. Throughout the evening, Smith remained patient. He didn't rush anyone. He didn't argue. He didn't show frustration. Instead, he allowed the family's trust to grow naturally. Rain and the girls picked out clothes. The children smiled as they tried to decide what they liked best. Among the items Cherish chose was a bright orange dress, decorated with colorful fruit patterns. It wasn't expensive, but to an 8-year-old preparing for a special trip to California, it was perfect. She couldn't wait to wear it. That dress would later become one of the most heartbreaking symbols of the entire case. As the shopping continued, another disturbing detail emerged from the investigation. According to Rain's later statements to investigators, Donald Smith had taken Cherish toward the fitting room area more than once during the evening. At the time, it didn't fully register as unusual. The store was crowded. People were everywhere. Rain was trying to keep track of 3 young daughters while shopping. Nothing about the situation seemed immediately threatening. Only after Cherish disappeared would those moments replay endlessly in her mind. She would later tell investigators she wished she had recognized the warning signs sooner. But hindsight has a way of making ordinary moments seem obvious when, at the time, they weren't. As the hours passed, the store slowly became quieter. Customers began making their final purchases. Employees started preparing for closing. By around 10 o'clock that night, everyone was tired. The girls had been shopping for hours. They were hungry, ready to go home. There was still one problem. The wife Donald Smith had promised would meet them at Walmart never arrived. Looking back, that should have been the first unmistakable sign that something wasn't right. Instead, Smith offered another explanation, then another solution. Let's grab something to eat before you head home. Near the front of the Walmart was a McDonald's restaurant. It sounded harmless. It was inside the store, surrounded by customers, covered by surveillance cameras, exactly the kind of public place where nobody expects a child to disappear. At approximately 10:44 p.m., Donald Smith turned toward Rain. "I'll go get the food." Then Cherish spoke up, excited, full of the same innocent enthusiasm she'd shown all evening. She wanted to go with him. Rain gave her a simple instruction: get cheeseburgers. It was the kind of conversation millions of parents have every day. Small, forgettable, completely ordinary. She watched as her daughter walked away beside Donald Smith. Cherish didn't look frightened. She didn't hesitate. She simply followed the man everyone believed was helping them. It would be the last time Rain Perrywinkle ever saw her daughter alive. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Something began to feel wrong. Rain looked toward the McDonald's counter. The lights were off. No employees, no customers. The restaurant had already closed hours earlier. Confused, she looked around the front of the store. There was no sign of Donald, no sign of Cherish. Then the overhead announcement echoed through Walmart. The store was closing. Customers were asked to make their final purchases and proceed toward the exits. In an instant, confusion became panic. Rain searched the surrounding aisles. She called out Cherish's name. Nothing. She checked nearby departments. Nothing. Her breathing quickened. She looked toward the entrance. Nothing. Her phone wasn't working. Desperate, she asked Walmart employees if she could borrow one. Every passing minute felt longer than the last. Finally, she reached emergency dispatch. The fear in her voice was immediate. She told the dispatcher,
Jacksonville 911, Robinson.
Hi, I'm at Walmart. I'm returned. I think I've been taken.
What do you mean?
Taken by...
An older man had taken her daughter. She explained everything she could remember. Gray hair, a white van, curtains covering the rear windows. She also mentioned something investigators would later find deeply significant. During the evening, Donald Smith had taken Cherish toward other areas of the store more than once. At the time, she hadn't fully realized how unusual it was. Now, every memory suddenly carried a different meaning. Officers were dispatched immediately. Within minutes, patrol cars filled Walmart's parking lot. Investigators secured surveillance footage before it could be overwritten. What those cameras revealed would eliminate any doubt about what had happened. Donald Smith hadn't wandered away with Cherish by accident. The footage showed him calmly walking out of Walmart with the 8-year-old girl beside him. Neither one appeared to be in a hurry. Seconds later, the white van pulled away into the Jacksonville night. For detectives, the case had transformed almost instantly. This was no longer a missing child. This was an abduction. And somewhere beyond the reach of Walmart's security cameras, time was running out. The moment Donald Smith's van disappeared from Walmart's parking lot, the clock started ticking. Every investigator on a child abduction case knows the same statistic. The first few hours are the most critical. If a child can be found quickly, the chances of bringing them home alive increase dramatically. If those hours are lost, the outcome often becomes far more tragic. For the officers racing toward Walmart that night, there was only one objective: find the little girl before it was too late. When Jacksonville Sheriff's Office deputies arrived, they immediately separated witnesses and began collecting every detail they could. Cherish Perrywinkle was terrified. Through tears, she repeated everything she could remember: the man's appearance, his gray hair, his calm voice, the white van with curtains covering the rear windows. She explained how he had approached them outside Dollar General, how he had offered to buy clothes for the children, how they had spent hours shopping together, and how, only minutes earlier, Cherish had walked away with him toward what she believed was a McDonald's counter. Detectives knew they couldn't waste a second. One team remained with Rain, another headed straight for Walmart's surveillance office. Inside, investigators began pulling footage from dozens of security cameras throughout the store. They needed one answer: where had Donald Smith gone? The recordings revealed far more than anyone expected. Camera after camera captured Smith shadowing the Perrywinkle family throughout the evening. Sometimes he walked beside them, sometimes several steps behind, sometimes waiting while the children looked through clothing racks. Watching the footage later, detectives said it appeared less like an act of kindness and more like someone patiently waiting for the perfect moment. Then came the images investigators feared most. One camera captured Donald Smith calmly walking toward the exit. Beside him, Cherish Perrywinkle. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't crying. She was simply walking beside a man she believed she could trust. Seconds later, another camera showed the pair leaving Walmart together. Outside, the white van pulled away into the darkness. There was no longer any uncertainty. This wasn't a missing child. This was a kidnapping. As detectives continued reviewing surveillance, patrol officers flooded Jacksonville looking for the van. Just before 11:36 p.m., police broadcast a county-wide description of the vehicle over emergency radio channels. Officers checked hotels, gas stations, major intersections, interstate exits, any place a suspect might stop. Meanwhile, investigators worked to identify the man responsible. Rain had never known his last name. She knew him only as the stranger who had offered to help. That made the surveillance footage even more important. Every image became evidence. Every minute became precious. As midnight passed, the investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives compared surveillance images with criminal databases. Tips began arriving from the public as local media interrupted programming to report the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl. Inside the sheriff's office, phones rang almost continuously. Every lead had to be checked. Every possibility investigated. Then, several hours into the search, investigators finally identified the man in the surveillance footage. His name was Donald James Smith. The atmosphere inside the command center changed instantly. Officers weren't dealing with an unknown suspect anymore. They were dealing with a convicted child predator whose criminal history stretched back decades. As detectives reviewed his record, the urgency intensified. Smith wasn't simply someone who had made a terrible decision. He was someone with a documented history of targeting children. Homicide detectives were brought into the investigation, not because they knew what had happened to Cherish, but because experience had taught them what offenders with histories like Smith's were capable of. At approximately 4 a.m., the Florida Department of Law Enforcement activated an Amber Alert. Across Florida, electronic highway signs lit up. Television stations interrupted broadcasts. Radio announcers repeated the description. Parents checking the morning news saw Cherish's smiling school photograph appear across their screens. A white van, gray-haired suspect, 8-year-old girl missing. Help find Cherish Perrywinkle. The search continued through the early morning hours. Then came the phone call that changed everything. A member of the public had recognized the white van after seeing media coverage of the case. It was exactly the kind of tip investigators had been hoping for. Police immediately responded to the reported location near a church in Jacksonville. As officers moved into the area, they spotted the van. But Donald Smith wasn't inside. The search expanded. Then, at approximately 9 a.m., officers located Smith walking near Interstate 95. He was alone. His clothes were soaking wet. Nearby were shopping bags containing items purchased during the Walmart trip only hours earlier. Cherish was nowhere to be found. Smith was taken into custody without incident. Veteran officers immediately noticed something unusual: his clothing, his shoes, the condition of his body. One experienced K-9 handler quietly looked toward nearby woods and marshland. According to later testimony, he believed they were about to find a crime scene. No one wanted to say the words aloud, but many already feared the search had become a recovery mission. Investigators retraced Smith's movements. K-9 teams entered the wooded area. The silence among officers grew heavier with every passing minute. Then, roughly 20 minutes after Smith's arrest, the search came to an end. Hidden near a shallow...
But the emotions were just overwhelming. I looked down, she had the same dress on my little daughter had. My daughter's 2 years younger than Cherish, same long brown hair, and I cried.
Creek. Investigators found Cherish Perrywinkle. She was still wearing the bright orange dress she had been so excited to wear on her flight to California. The same dress she had proudly picked out inside Walmart. The same dress she would never wear on the trip she had spent weeks looking forward to. For many investigators, it became one of the most heartbreaking images they would ever carry with them. The medical examiner would later determine that Cherish had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. The details were so disturbing that even experienced detectives would later describe the case as one of the most difficult of their careers. As word spread through the sheriff's office, hope disappeared. The mission had begun as a desperate race to rescue a missing child. It ended with officers notifying a family that every parent hopes never to become. A little girl who had gone shopping for a new dress would never make it home. For nearly 5 years, Cherish Perrywinkle's family
face to face with evil.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, the worst of the worst.
Family waited. 5 years of court filings, psychological evaluations, pre-trial hearings, legal motions, and repeated delays. For Rain Perrywinkle, every postponed hearing meant reliving the worst night of her life all over again. Finally, in February 2018, the trial of Donald James Smith began inside a Jacksonville courtroom. The man accused of kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering 8-year-old Cherish Perrywinkle entered the courtroom in a wheelchair. His appearance had changed since his arrest. Older, thinner, more fragile. But prosecutors reminded the jury that appearances had deceived people before. That was how this tragedy had started. The state of Florida wasn't asking jurors to rely on emotion. They were asking them to follow the evidence. And the evidence was overwhelming. Jurors watched Walmart surveillance footage documenting Smith's movements throughout the evening. Camera after camera showed him remaining close to the Perrywinkle family. Then, the final images. Donald Smith calmly walking out of Walmart beside Cherish, the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Investigators then presented the physical evidence recovered during the investigation. DNA evidence, cell phone records, witness testimony. The timeline fit together with remarkable precision. Every piece supported the same conclusion. Donald Smith had abducted Cherish from Walmart. No credible evidence pointed to anyone else. But the most emotional testimony came not from detectives. It came from Cherish's mother. Rain Perrywinkle walked into the courtroom carrying a grief few people can imagine. She described meeting Smith outside Dollar General, his offer to help, the shopping trip, the final conversation with Cherish, and the moment she realized McDonald's had already closed. More than once, her voice broke. Many people expected Smith's attorneys to challenge her account aggressively. After all, cross-examination is one of the most important parts of any criminal trial. But something unexpected happened. Donald Smith himself instructed his attorneys not to question Rain. There would be no cross-examination, no attempt to challenge the pain of a mother who had already lost everything. The courtroom moved on in silence. Then came testimony that proved difficult even for seasoned professionals to hear. The medical examiner described the injuries Cherish had suffered. At one point, the weight of the evidence became so overwhelming that the proceedings briefly paused. Jurors sat quietly. Several struggled to look at the exhibits placed before them. Prosecutors didn't need dramatic language. The evidence spoke for itself. When it came time for the defense to present its case, there was remarkably little to offer. Smith's attorneys called no witnesses during the guilt phase. They presented no alternative suspect, no competing version of events. And when closing arguments arrived, the defense declined to give one. It was an extraordinary decision. Instead, the case went directly to the jury. 12 people walked into the deliberation room carrying weeks of testimony. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, witness statements. For many watching, the verdict felt inevitable. Still, no one expected what happened next. The jury deliberated for approximately 14 minutes. Just 14. In that short time, they reached unanimous verdicts. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of sexual battery. On every count, Donald James Smith was convicted. For Cherish's family, the verdict brought accountability, but it couldn't bring back the little girl whose future had been stolen. The trial then entered its second stage. Florida law required a separate penalty phase to determine whether Smith should spend the rest of his life in prison or be sentenced to death. Prosecutors now widened the jury's view. This wasn't only about what happened to Cherish. It was about who Donald Smith had been for decades.
I don't view children as sexual objects. I don't view them as sexual objects or sexual.
Jurors heard testimony detailing his long history of offenses against children. One witness in particular left a lasting impression. Carrie Ann Buck. As a 13-year-old girl in 1992, she said Smith had tried to lure.
Smith tried to kidnap her when she was 13.
He told me to get the fuck in the pan.
Did the defendant chase after you in that van?
Lure her into his van. She escaped only by hiding inside playground equipment until help arrived. Her testimony revealed something chilling. Cherish wasn't the beginning. She was the latest victim in a pattern stretching back decades. The defense argued that Smith suffered from significant mental health disorders and impaired impulse control. Experts testified about abnormalities in his brain function, but even those same experts described him as manipulative, callous, and lacking empathy. Rather than creating sympathy, much of the testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that Smith remained a continuing danger. After hearing all the evidence, the jury returned once again. This time, their decision would determine whether Donald Smith lived or died. After roughly 2 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. They recommended the death penalty. The judge accepted that recommendation. Addressing Smith directly, he stated that through his actions, Smith had forfeited his place in society. Outside the courthouse, emotions overflowed. Some family members embraced. Others wept quietly. Reporters surrounded attorneys and investigators. For Cherish's father, Billy, for Rain, and for everyone who had loved the bright little girl excited about flying to California, the sentence marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the pain. Because no courtroom, no matter what punishment it delivers, can ever restore the life that was taken. For many people, Donald Smith's conviction closed the criminal case, but it didn't answer the question that continued haunting Florida for years afterward. How was he free in the first place? As investigators, journalists, and legal experts looked back through Smith's history, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Cherish Perrywinkle's murder wasn't simply the result of one terrible decision made by one dangerous man. It was also the final chapter in a series of missed opportunities. Years before Cherish was born, Donald Smith had already been known to law enforcement. His criminal history stretched back to the late 1970s. Over the decades, he accumulated convictions involving children, repeatedly demonstrating the same disturbing pattern. Each new offense should have strengthened the warning. Instead, he kept returning to the community. Perhaps the most troubling discovery came from Florida's own civil commitment process. After serving an earlier prison sentence, Smith had been evaluated by mental health professionals, responsible for determining whether certain violent sexual offenders remained too dangerous to release. Their findings were alarming. According to court records, experts concluded that Smith presented an exceptionally high risk of committing another sexual offense. Some recommended that he be civilly committed under Florida's Jimmy Rice Act, a law created specifically to keep the most dangerous sexually violent predators confined, even after completing their prison sentences. Only a very small percentage of offenders ever receive that recommendation. Donald Smith was one of them. Yet despite those warnings, he was released. Years later, that decision would be examined again and again. Legal analysts questioned whether critical evidence had been fully presented during the commitment proceedings. Former prosecutors openly wondered how someone with Smith's documented history had managed to regain his freedom. For many people following the case, the question wasn't whether Donald Smith was responsible. That answer had never been in doubt. The question was whether Cherish's murder could have been prevented. The answer to that question remains a matter of debate. What isn't debated is that Donald Smith alone chose to commit these crimes. No legal mistake, no failed policy, no procedural error forced him to kidnap and murder an innocent child. The responsibility belongs entirely to him. But understanding how dangerous offenders move through the justice system remains an important part of understanding cases like this. While those conversations unfolded, another family was trying to survive a grief that no court ruling could erase. In the weeks following Cherish's murder, Florida's child welfare system removed Rain Perrywinkle's two younger daughters, Destiny and Naya, from her custody. The decision sparked public debate. Some believed the state was protecting the remaining children. Others questioned whether a grieving mother had become the target of blame for a crime committed by someone else. Rain fought to keep her daughters. She attended hearings, worked through the legal process, and spoke publicly about wanting her family back together. But over time, the courts determined she had not completed the requirements necessary to regain custody. Eventually, Destiny and Naya were adopted by relatives and moved to Australia. For Rain, the loss became almost impossible to describe. She had already buried one daughter. Now, she was separated from the two children she still had. In interviews over the years, she has spoken openly about carrying both forms of grief at the same time. Not only mourning Cherish, but mourning the family she once had. Cherish's father, Billy Perrywinkle, has also shared the memory that never leaves him. He was in California, counting down the hours until his daughter arrived. Instead of meeting her at the airport, he received a phone call no parent should ever receive. The child he'd been waiting to hug was gone. For both parents, life would forever be divided into two parts: everything before June 21, 2013, and everything after. The legal process, however, wasn't completely over. Even after receiving a death sentence, Donald Smith continued filing appeals through the courts. In 2021, the Florida Supreme Court unanimously upheld his conviction, finding the evidence against him overwhelming. Later, his new attorneys argued that mistakes made during the penalty phase of his trial entitled him to a new sentencing hearing. Among their arguments, they claimed trial counsel had made strategic errors, particularly regarding expert testimony presented to the jury. The courts reviewed those claims carefully. In 2024, a judge denied Smith's request for a new penalty phase. His legal team continued appealing, arguing the issue before the Florida Supreme Court in 2025. As of this documentary, Donald James Smith remains on Florida's death row, while those post-conviction proceedings continue. Those appeals are part of the legal process available in capital cases. They do not change the jury's verdict, nor do they erase the evidence presented during the trial. Today, visitors to Jacksonville can still find memorials dedicated to Cherish Perrywinkle. Flowers, stuffed animals, photographs, handwritten notes from strangers. Many of them contain the same message, a promise that she will never be forgotten. Because beyond every headline, every court opinion, and every television report, there was a little girl who loved drawing animals, who laughed with her sisters, who proudly picked out a bright orange dress because she couldn't wait to see her father. That is who Cherish Perrywinkle was, and that is who deserves to be remembered. There are some stories that end when the courtroom doors close. This isn't one of them. More than a decade has passed since June 21, 2013. Children who were Cherish Perrywinkle's age when she disappeared are now adults. Some have graduated from college. Some have started families of their own. Some are raising children who are now close to the age Cherish was when her life was taken. But Cherish never had that chance. She never got to celebrate another birthday. She never boarded the flight to California that she had been so excited about. She never got to hug her father at the airport. She never got to grow into the woman she was meant to become. Instead, she remains forever 8 years old. When people hear about this case, it's easy to remember the headlines. The surveillance footage, the Amber Alert, the trial, the sentence. But those aren't the things her family remembers first. They remember a little girl who loved to laugh, a daughter who filled a home with energy, a big sister who enjoyed playing with her younger siblings, a child who loved drawing animals, and believed that the world was mostly full of good people. That is the life that was stolen. Not a headline, not a statistic. A little girl. Over the years, many people have asked what lesson should be taken from Cherish's story. Some say it's about being cautious around strangers. Others point to the criminal justice system and ask whether known high-risk offenders should face closer scrutiny before being released. Still others focus on the importance of rapid public alerts and coordinated investigations when a child goes missing. Each of those conversations matters. Each one may help protect another child in the future. But perhaps the most important lesson is also the simplest. Evil rarely announces itself. It doesn't always look frightening. It doesn't always arrive with threats or violence. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it offers help. Sometimes it hides behind patience, politeness, and the appearance of kindness. That doesn't mean we should live in constant fear of one another. Communities are built on compassion. Neighbors help neighbors. Strangers perform acts of generosity every day without expecting anything in return. Most of those moments end exactly as they should, with someone receiving help and going safely home. The tragedy of this case is not that kindness exists. The tragedy is that one man chose to weaponize it. Donald Smith exploited trust for his own horrific purposes. That choice was his alone. And because of that choice, an innocent child lost her future, while countless lives around her were changed forever. If there is any comfort to be found in this heartbreaking story, perhaps it lies in the fact that Cherish has not been forgotten. Her name continues to be spoken. Her photograph continues to remind people of the bright, joyful child she was. Her case continues to be studied by investigators, prosecutors, victim advocates, and legal professionals who want to prevent another family from experiencing the same nightmare. In that way, her legacy lives on. Not because of the man who took her life, but because of the people who refused to let her memory disappear. As we've followed this story from a simple shopping trip to a courtroom verdict, one truth has remained constant. Cherish Perrywinkle deserved so much more than 8 short years. She deserved birthdays, school graduations, family vacations, a first job, a driver's license, falling in love, growing old surrounded by people who cherished her. Those ordinary moments are easy to overlook until someone is denied the chance to experience them. If this story has stayed with you today, let it be because of who Cherish was, not because of the man who stole her future. Remember the little girl excited about a new orange dress. Remember the child counting down the hours until she could see her father. Remember the sister whose laughter once filled her home. That is the story worth carrying forward. Because in the end, the measure of a life isn't found in how it ended. It's found in the love that remains after it's gone. Cherish Perrywinkle left this world far too soon. But the love her family had for her, and the determination of those who continue telling her story with honesty, dignity, and respect, ensure that she will never be forgotten. May she rest in peace. If you made it to the end of this documentary, thank you for taking the time to remember Cherish's story with us. Every view, every thoughtful comment, and every respectful conversation helps keep the memory of victims like Cherish alive, not for sensationalism, but so they are never forgotten. If you believe these stories deserve to be told with care, accuracy, and compassion, please consider subscribing to the channel. We share in-depth true crime documentaries that focus not only on what happened, but on who the victims were, the investigations that sought justice, and the lessons that may help prevent future tragedies. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of the people you love, And never forget the names and lives behind the headlines.